There he is, the great Andrew Spar, President Spar, my good friend, the go-to person for me with all things education, obviously Florida education, but always happy to talk to you. Thank you. Happy midsummer. I was going to say dream, but maybe nightmare. There's a lot to talk about.
It's not midsummer in Florida. Public schools go back in like 2 weeks. Teachers go back here in Florida. It's almost over for us. It's like you blink and summer's over. I don't know how that happens.
Is that the heat? Why did you do that?
I don't know. Florida's always been big on starting early. Where southern states are that way. I think, the northern states start after Labor Day. Everyone else goes back as early as they can. There's some school districts. I was just talking to the president in Arizona, and a lot of their school districts started this week in Arizona. So crazy, but some districts go back really early.
Before you became an organizer and started working for the union, I mean, for years you were an educator yourself, a teacher. Music?
Yes, I taught string instruments, violin, viola, cello, string bass to little over 500 students at Turry T. Small Elementary School in Daytona Beach, a school that had a really high poverty rate, around 98%. It's where I met my wife. So arguably one of the best things about teaching there was I met my wife, and she still teaches there to this day.
And as far as what you've seen it all in terms of the different types of school districts and demographics. And one might even say Florida would be one of the most diverse types of diversities in terms of ethnicity and socioeconomics, in terms of rural and urban and all the different demographics and school districts. You guys pretty much have it covered from the Keys to the Panhandle, right? In terms of demographics.
Yeah, look, Florida has rural, very country, if you will, parts of the state. We have military bases, several of them in the state of Florida. We have the urban areas, certainly in Orlando and Tampa and Miami and Jacksonville. We have some of the suburban areas around those cities. We have farming and agriculture big time, especially in South Central Florida. You get into Plant City where the strawberries are, and you have a lot of migrant workers who work in the fields down there. And then even in where I live in Volusia County, you have the fern capital of the world. So all the greenery that goes into those roses you may buy at Valentine's Day, or flowers you buy throughout the year, come from Volusia County, Florida.
In terms of these ICE raids, we had some understanding that they would be focusing on blue states, blue cities like California and New York. But I guess they're going everywhere, Texas and Florida included. What has been the atmosphere like, and what are what's the information, what's the guidance for educators who might have young people in their classrooms that could potentially, their parents more likely, but they themselves could get removed from school or kidnapped, if you will?
Yeah, so we have not seen any raids in our public schools in Florida at all. There's been stories that there might be. There's been a lot of apprehension and fear. We've heard stories of parents keeping their kids home. But we haven't seen that. Look at the University of Florida State University in Tallahassee. A few months ago, there was actually a raid on a construction site where they were building housing for students. And they detained many of the construction workers, some of them, many of them immigrants, some of them may have been undocumented. I don't know. We never heard a full report from that. But what it did is it put a chilling effect. So that construction, last I heard, had come to a screeching halt where they couldn't get workers to come finish building the building. There have been a lot of big time farmers in Florida who have asked for the U.S. to stop coming into farms or threatening to come into farms because they were also finding that workers weren't showing up anymore, and it was becoming harder and harder for them to get out in the field and get their farming done. And so yeah, there's certainly an impact in the economy in Florida. And then of course we have alligator Alcatraz in Florida, which there's certainly been a lot of information coming on it at the Miami Herald and other papers have done an incredible job reporting on what's going on down there. There was just a story that came out today of a 15-year-old that was picked up and taken to alligator Alcatraz, a place that's only supposed to be for the worst of criminals and for adults. And so clearly there's a lot of chaos and confusion. And look, one of my big concerns, there's certainly environmental concerns for where this place is located, but it's also in prime real estate for hurricanes, and this is hurricane season.
Oh, wow.
And what's going to happen in those time periods. So it's certainly not a good environment. We actually, through our national unions, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, have produced information for educators on how to help migrant families who may be concerned. So it's got tools and tips on what we should educate families on if they have any concerns. And we are continuing to do things. We recently teamed up with AFT and the Mexican consulate in Orlando and did some citizenship clinics there for people who are on track to become citizens, because we believe we should be part of the community and helping the community and helping people who are on track to become legalized citizens. But one of our biggest stories out of Florida in terms of education was a teacher in Miami-Dade, and I think you may have reported on this too, several months ago, who was in the process to become a legal citizen, showed up for one of his hearings, was denied and arrested and sent and deported back home. And that was a science teacher in Miami-Dade, very popular teacher in a critical shortage area, doing great work with students and in his community, and just kicked out of the United States randomly. So this is not about getting the bad people out, as the president likes to say. This is really having a huge impact on families and community and our way of life as Americans, I think.
It's disgusting and horrible, and that story in particular. But I mean, there are just hundreds of them, and they just come out every day. Where, yesterday we saw this woman that was walking out of some naturalization process. She has a smile on her face. The door opens, it's ice, and they take her. It's like she goes from being so excited. I mean, the whole frustrating thing about immigration has always been the simplest way to say it is there isn't a normal pathway to citizenship or to some kind of work visa or school, education visa. It's very, very hard. It's very convoluted, and it's meant to be that way. So, all right, let me step back down off my box and get back to you in education, because the other issue I obviously wanted to talk to the great Andrew Spar about is anything Florida education related, which often you guys are like the tip of the spear because Project 2025 was piloted in your state. But I just have to ask you about this headline from this week, because the Supreme Court decided apparently that our tiny, weak little leader and his minions can actually cut like all these numbers of people from the U.S. Department of Education. Keeping tabs on what the hell is going on there is hard enough for any of us. I'm sure it is for you as well. And it's a multifaceted attack on the Department of Education. But this development this week, what does this mean? Laying off more than 1,300 education department workers. Many have already been laid off, and then we can get into more of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's start with this. What does the Department of Education do? I don't think a lot of people understand that. Even even a lot of your listeners, Pete, who certainly are well educated on issues because of the work you do and because they care about what's going on, may not understand what the U.S. Department of Education does. So let's start with the fact that, as any federal agency, they are responsible for implementing and enforcing federal law. And part of that, one of the biggest areas they do is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. That deals with students who have both physical and learning disabilities, maybe even some mental challenges and disabilities. And so making sure that their rights are protected, which is governed by federal law, is an important part of what they do. There is a ton of funding attached to that. And that program has never been fully funded either, by the way. But for students who have learning disabilities, who have physical disabilities, making sure they're getting the education they deserve and need, making sure that school districts are following federal law, are writing individual education plans known as IEPs, so that those students are getting what they need, not necessarily what districts want to provide, but what they need. And that's true whether it's in the public school system or in charter schools or in private schools. There are federal requirements to make sure that students are getting those services. That's a huge aspect of what the U.S. Department of Education does. They also oversee a lot of migrant programs in our schools. So for English language learners or students who English is not a first language or English is not spoken home at all, making sure that those students have advocates, have programs in place so that we're focused on their learning and not just whether or not they speak the language correctly at this point in time. So making sure that those students are getting support, also overseen by the U.S. Department of Education. the Title I program, funding for students who live in poverty. We know that education is the great equalizer for people in our country and for people in the world. If they have a great education, they can certainly work towards bettering themselves in society, getting ahead. And so those programs for Title I schools, making sure those dollars go directly to school districts, directly to those schools that have the students that live in poverty, the highest percentage of students living in poverty, making sure they have enrichment programs, enhancement programs, before and after school programs, etc. That's all done by the Department of Education. And then I can go on and on, higher education grants, student loans, all of that.
It would seem that the cuts are going to affect likely the most vulnerable communities, schools, and populations, and not just around poverty, but around learning disabilities and different things that you need, handicaps of developmental disabilities that you need resources for. And I guess my question is, at what point do, frankly, the rich white schools lose any funding? Because if we just lost, if the rich white schools, mine is more diverse, but still dominant white in Rockland County, as you know, but if we just lost a little bit, if we lost something and we had to make up that gap and it made a difference. And the reason I ask this question is because that's when people might start to be upset. That's when people might start to understand what the Department of Education does and why its role is so vital. But if it's just, poor Black and brown people or people with, disabilities, or as you mentioned, English as a second language, then people aren't going to care as much. And I hate to be so kind of transparent about it, but I'm trying to see what makes people move, because we just don't. I am of the firm belief that most Americans don't care about marginalized communities and poor people enough to get out and do something about it, unless they're seeing, as you are, images that make you act, these images of people getting kidnapped, but you don't see images of education cuts, teacher shortages. And I mean, those things aren't as visceral. More than anybody about the damage that means. But you know what I'm saying? When do the affluent folks see any difference or any cuts or any damage in their local school budgets, which are, I think, mostly funded by property taxes?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that the overwhelming part of what the U.S. Department of Education is for the more marginalized communities. But look, students with disabilities exist in every community. I grew up in Ardsley, New York, upper middle class, arguably family, had a great education. I'm dyslexic. I got services. I had an IEP. My program was funded by federal dollars. So, for families who have students with disabilities, even in affluent communities, these cuts will impact them. Look, middle income families struggle a lot with higher education too, because they're caught in that gap, right? They don't qualify for financial aid, but they don't make enough money that they can afford to send their kid to the school the child wants to go to. So then there's Pell Grants and there's other funds like that become available that are also run by the U.S. Department of Education. Let's also not forget that a lot of students go to school on student loans. And that loan forgiveness program is overseen by the U.S. Department of Education, which said they've stopped it. They're not doing it. I mean, I literally had a teacher call me recently saying, hey, what do I do? I'm trying to get the student loan forgiveness. And I said, how long have you been teaching? And they told me it's a couple of decades. And I said, did you take advantage of it under the last president? And they were like, well, I was going to get around to it. Well, that's a problem because now, where Biden was pushing through trying to make sure that loan forgiveness, especially for educators, was taken care of, who are dedicating. Let's remember, teachers are dedicating their life to the education of our children, to our community. They've stopped all of that right now. And so that does have an impact, I think, on some of our middle-class neighborhoods and more affluent communities, but certainly not to the degree that we see in the migrant communities, in our poor communities, because that's where a lot of the federal programs are written for.
In terms of the other cuts that we're seeing and the other moves that are being made at the federal level, before we get to what's going on in Florida, of course, how much uncertainty is that creating for districts that need to plan their budgets and space and resources and staffing for?
So not only are we talking about, the Supreme Court ruling in which they said they can start dismantling the Department of Education, even though they can't close it, that would take an act of Congress. What we also saw the Trump administration do with the U.S. Department of Education is they are holding back dollars, Title II, Title III, Title IV dollars that go directly to school districts, and school districts count on that money. And we're talking millions of dollars, $400 million in Florida, I think over 600 million in New York, 600 plus million in California and Texas, over $500 million. So we're talking about big dollar amounts. And what does that mean? So in Florida and across this nation, those dollars are for programs such as the Century 21 grants. Those are grants that are given to schools for before and after school enrichment and enhancement programs in some of our poorest communities. And all of a sudden you have these programs, they're expecting these dollars to come by. They've been given these grants. They have set up for these after school programs, employed teachers and staff to run these programs. And all of a sudden they may not be getting this money because the U.S. Department of Education is holding back those dollars. Students who speak English as a second or other language, it's another area, the English language learners. Those are programs, migrant programs that are in our schools. Teachers are employed, staff is employed. They're ready to welcome the students back in a few weeks. And again, hold back of those dollars. And then teacher training. And how does that impact schools all across this country? Very often new teachers coming in are paid, their programs are funded through these dollars, these federal dollars that are being held back right now. So really some major impacts as school districts are getting ready to start planning the year, and all of a sudden we don't know if those dollars are coming.
Yeah, that's
Congress didn't authorize it. This is literally the Trump administration just saying we're not going to send the money down.
This is the top story. I feel like I should have asked you about this first. We're hearing about the Supreme Court decision that's allowing the cuts to be made, the firings to happen, the layoffs. But the top story, as you told me before we hit record here, is this holding back of $6.2 billion. The U.S. Department of Education is refusing to distribute, as I believe they are supposed to under law. There's all these conversations about the role of Congress and the power of the purse, and how when they've allocated and sanctioned and passed legislation for funding, that is not getting there, or even worse, it's being clawed back. But when you talk about that an act of Congress would be required to close the Department of Education, my understanding is the workaround is you could just relocate the Department of Education in one room at Mar-a-Lago, have some guy named Gary come in and turn the lights on and off every day, and technically it's still there. So it's not closed, but it's basically non-functioning. Is there something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, literally that's what they're talking about with the Supreme Court ruling, is they can gut all of the employees, but then there's programs that Congress has authorized. There are programs that Congress has funded. And now you have the Trump administration saying, well, we're going to hold that money back. We're not going to send those dollars down to school districts. And very often those dollars flow right to school districts. They don't go through the state. They go right to school district. There's no shortstop in this. There's no skimming some money off the top. These are dollars that are going directly to our kids from the federal government. And now you have the administration holding back those dollars that Congress has said to send. So what we're encouraging people to do is contact your congressman, contact your senator, saying, hey, what's going on here? You need to get on the U.S. Department of Education to release those dollars. Kids' education is at stake here. This is not something else. This is not some frivolous thing. This was not a DOJ recommendation or anything. This is literally the administration saying, we're just not sending the money and we don't care.
The administration saying, Kim Nyborg writes in the chat, it's the administration saying, fuck them kids. Am I right? I mean, no one would know that more than you, because you see this every day in Florida's classrooms and working with Florida's teachers each and every day. Tell me about what's going on down there. Where I was right to say that, right? Like, isn't everybody say that Project 2025 was piloted in your state? I felt like maybe you told me that.
Yeah, essentially everything that's in Project 2025 was piloted here, it seems like, just about. And so, yeah, Florida, look, let's start with this. Florida started so-called education reform back in 1999. It was when Jeb Bush was elected governor in 98. He took over. He started this whole education reform movement in Florida. Florida has led, if you will, the nation in this education reform movement. Let me tell you what it's meant here in Florida. In 1998, before all this went into effect, I'm just going to give some numbers here. We had 680 pages of educational law. That's a lot. Today, we have 1,330, nearly double the pages in our education law book of all these laws. What does that mean? That's high stakes testing. So when parents are complaining about high stakes testing, that's where it came from, in that law. grading of schools based on those high stakes tests, how we pay teachers, how teachers get training, the amount of training teachers have to have, which continues to grow here in Florida. We have to have reading training, training for students with special needs, training for everything under the sun that we have to do, including training for how to deal with active shooters on campus, right? That's all in education law. The security around campus, the requirement to have all these locked classrooms, locked doors, so it's more like a prison, all in the law. Teacher training. I said, teacher evaluation is another thing. Paying teachers, all the problems we've had in Florida. So what's happened since then? In 1998, Florida ranked 23rd in the nation in average teacher pay. Today, we're 50th in the nation.
Unbelievable. 23rd now in 98, and then
98. And 50th today in the nation between the 50 states and Washington, D.C. But let me go further, right? Student test scores. SAT scores are lower today than they were in 1998 in the state of Florida. Our NAEP scores, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the nation's report card. We're doing worse today than we were in 1998. Yet these guys keep going out there saying, oh, Florida's leading the nation in education. No, we're not. Clearly, we're not. And we have the worst teacher and staff shortage we've ever seen, right? So like kids are literally losing out. People are leaving the profession because we've doubled the number of pages of education law in the state of Florida that have negatively impacted our families, our students, our communities, our public schools, which are central to our democracy, quite honestly. And so that's a huge
25 to 30 years of Republican rule in your state, right? Like it's really transformed in that period of time to one of the reddest states in many ways. I mean, you've been involved with the state legislature and knowing who's running it, lobbying everybody there, and all kinds of different organized drives that you guys are doing at Florida Education Association. How do you keep, morale up? I mean, like you're the best at that. I've seen you in action, and it's part of the responsibility of the role as the leader of the teachers union there. But like I've met a lot of those folks, amazing human beings, of course. Like what works in these really difficult times to keep people?
Well, let me say there's definitely bright spots in what we do. First of all, any educator knows when you're working with kids, there's nothing better in the world.
That's the reward.
And I get to represent and work with people who work with kids who are those kinds of people, right? They care, they dedicate, they pour their souls out. They love what they do. And as educators, I learned this in college. There's a time where you have to throw the lesson plan out, right? Things that, something happens. You've talked about stuff before, something happens, a kid loses a loved one or something happens in the world and kids want to talk about it. You literally throw out the lesson plan. You have that learning opportunity right in front of you and you take it, you seize it. It's harder and harder for teachers to do that in Florida, but we still do that, right? And we've been under attack in Florida, as you point out, for 25 years. And the party that's supposedly about less government has certainly not done that when it comes to education. And they've tried to kill us off and they've been unsuccessful. They passed a legislation 2 years ago that said they were going to take out the teachers union in Florida. The governor just said this the other day. He appointed a new chief financial officer in the state of Florida who sponsored the legislation that was meant to kill us. And he said something about that, how we're killing the teachers union in the state of Florida. Let me tell you, he's not. We still have almost as many members as when they started this legislation. We've had elections in the state of Florida, new law. We have to have elections almost every year in a lot of our local unions in the state of Florida. We, as of yesterday, are 115-0 against the state of Florida.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Under your leadership especially. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing.
And listen, teachers in the state of Florida on an average of over 95% are saying we want to keep our union, right? Like educators get it. They understand it. And that's what keeps us going. I think that's what keeps us moving is that we never seen an opportunity. I use this quote a lot now. It's a quote by Winston Churchill. The pessimist sees a challenge in every opportunity. The optimist sees an opportunity in every challenge. And that's who educators are. That's who
steal that. All right. Well, I didn't ask you about that other scandal, that voucher scandal before you told me about. That's pretty outrageous. Yeah. Tell people what that's about and how that's probably, again, something that's being, trialed there so they can do it everywhere. Maybe it's happened.
Yeah, we have what they call universal school choice here in the state of Florida, which means the private schools get to choose whether or not they let your kids in. And we're funding it, right? Taxpayers are funding it. And so here's what happened in Florida.
Right.
Yeah, this year was the first year. Open it all up. Most of the money went to kids already in private school or already in homeschool. $4 billion siphoned off the top. Well, there were 22,000 students enrolled in our public schools, but somehow appeared on the voucher roster list. And so the state didn't know what to do. They kind of figured something out. They kind of split the difference. They sent some of the money to vouchers, some of it to the public schools, but public schools lost millions of dollars. Turns out all 22,000 were in the public schools. They're now trying to get the money back from the voucher program to give back to the public schools. Literally. I mean, this is corruption at its worst. There's no, I said there are 1,330 pages of law that govern public schools in Florida. There are 40 that govern vouchers and private schools.
Because they over regulate and try to make it harder for the public, and they under regulate and make it easier for the private wealthy folk.
Yeah, there's no accountability. So they just say these kids, and what we think happened is these may have been families who expressed interest about going to a private school and getting a voucher. It may have been someone who said, we're going to do it, but they couldn't get into the private school they wanted to, or the private school wouldn't take it. It could be that they may change their mind when they went back and talked to the public school, but the voucher company claimed them, and that's because they make money off of this. And so that's the real challenge in all of this. And listen, the Florida Senate, we've been working with Republicans. You have to in the state of Florida. Yeah. And we've been working with Republicans, and they want more barriers on this. And the Senate actually passed legislation to put that in place. The House wouldn't do it. So we're going to continue to work to try to get that done, because it's got to, as the president of the Senate here in the state of Florida, a Republican, said at the beginning of last session that we need to, allow public schools to compete. We need to let teachers teach. And that's all we're asking for. Let us teach, let us compete. Because by the way, if you let us compete, no one can do what the public schools do. No one.
That's for sure. I've seen it over and over. All right, I'll let you go to your weekend. I really appreciate you stopping in and checking up with us. We got to do it more often because it's such an important issue. You're on the front line every day. Andrew Spar, thank you very much for joining me as always.
Pete, it's always great to see you. Hope the family's good. Hope everyone's good out there. And listen, we got to keep spreading love. There's too much hate in this country. We got to spread the love.
You're one of the best at it, and you've taught me all kinds of new ways to do it. Thank you, my friend. I'm going to remove you from the room just to say thank you. Stay there if you can for a moment, Andrew. Thank you to everybody watching. I'll be back at 2:00. We're just talking education. When then Spar will talk healthcare with Dr. Rob Davidson, who's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Healthcare, and he's an ER physician in West Michigan. Real smart. Lots to talk about with RFK's nuttery. So I'll see you back here at 2 p.m. if you want. Thanks for joining me, and support the show. It's ad-free. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Thank you. Bye. See you at home. I don't know who I'm talking to.